Rise Zion. My name is Seth, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Brother Tyler, who we met, who I met on X. We started a conversation. He seemed like a very interesting person, and he seemed to have a story behind the character who he is on X. And so I reached out to him, and he agreed to come on the show, and he has a very unique story about why he left the church and about why he came back, about some of the miraculous things that happened to him. As you know, on this show, we document miracles and we document God's hand in our life and God's influence reaching out to us and trying to get us to do what he would like us to do, right? You know, and this is a really unique story. I'm just going to let Tyler go ahead and introduce himself a little bit and go ahead and dive right into his story. Tyler.
So I'm Tyler, run an account on X as Seth stated. I'll just dive right into it. My story: I was born in the church and got baptized when I was 8. You know, typical born in the church story. And then when I was about 13 or 14, I came across a lot of atheist philosophers, and I heard their arguments against not just, Christianity, but religion in general. And they did convince me, and I did sort of forsake religion and spirituality in general as being just sort of like nonsense, and kind of became, an arrogant teenager. And this went on until I was around 21, almost 22. Obviously in my adult life, had to get a job to support myself, and my reconnection with spirituality starts at my job, where I was inspecting trains, and I would get this prompting, like this still voice telling me to check something, which might not have been a part of the inspection I was doing, might not have been something that gets checked at all, really. And I'd be like, okay, well, we'll go check this out. And I would check it out. It would be like a brake line in like this really obscure place, or like this wire that the connection was coming loose on. And I would sort of ask myself, well, how do I know to check this? Like, I had no logical reason to go look at these components, and yet when I did, there was something wrong with them. And so I sort of started looking into spirituality again. And I started off with sort of asking spiritual people who I agreed with on political issues. And I started off with looking into what a lot of people would probably say is the resurgence of European paganism.
Interesting.
And yeah, so pretty odd starting point as far as religion goes. But
what
I
made
started
you
talking to them about it.
What made you talk with them?
We talked about political stuff before I had my spiritual reawakening, and we agreed on a lot of political stuff. And so I was like, okay, well, we'll see what they think about spirituality. And I sort of came to realize a lot of them aren't very spiritual. They are more or less embracing the resurgence of paganism out of a need to satiate their identity.
Interesting. Okay.
But anyway, I continued looking, and I started looking at Christianity again. And I started rereading the scriptures and the doctrines of the church, and I did get a lot of the same feeling, that still voice and burning in the bosom, as it's described. And I was like, okay, so maybe there is some truth here, but I'll check out the other sects. I'll check out what they have to say. And so I checked out a few other churches, Catholic and Baptist specifically, and they're good people. I'm not gonna say they're like
Yeah.
terrible people or anything, but a lot of what they have to say about the church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is not true.
Ah,
Like, you hear a lot of really outlandish stuff on the internet, and a lot of them just sort of regurgitated as if it were true. And
mm,
I don't think a lot of them have actually looked into it. They heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend, so on and so forth. And they just sort of take it as truth because they trust the person who told them, and it's not true.
mm,
And so I sort of started asking myself, like, if they can't truthfully address the claims of the church, then like what else could they not be
possibly
truthfully
getting
addressing?
wrong. Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I think that a lot of people have the same experience where initially they're kind of put off by the lies that are being spread about the church. And then they
Yeah,
start looking into it a little deeper, and then they find out that these things that they're saying aren't quite accurate, or they're outright lies and fabrications, like you noticed. And then it just kind of drives them into the church, like basically because they start investigating it, and then they realize, hey, this stuff isn't true. Like,
yeah,
so
yeah. Like, something I that people point to a lot is this old cartoon. It's like called God Makers.
oh yeah, yeah.
And I'm
Mhm.
sure we've all heard of it. If you haven't heard of it, you probably aren't on the internet at all.
Mm. Yeah, I've heard of that.
um, but yeah, that cartoon, there's just a lot of inaccuracies, um, especially in regards to theology
Yeah,
and like, you know,
how
and
it
then
chooses to portray things is just not accurate. So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and so you know, I sort of was like, okay, well, let's look at the church a little closer. Let's look at the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants a little closer and all that. And I'm a pretty political person, but a lot of the warnings in the Book of Mormon, in the New Testament too, and pretty much all the Scripture, there's warnings everywhere, but they've all come to be warranted. Pretty much every single one, in my opinion. Like the Book of Mormon warning about secret combinations conspiring to overthrow the freedoms of all lands and people and complete the work of the devil.
Hmm.
And, in the New Testament, where it warns about false prophets and wolves in sheep's clothing. And we do see that in a lot of places. Like, I forgot. It was like this Episcop, I can't pronounce it, Episcopolitan,
Hmm.
I think, who has this female bishop who was sort of getting flamed about a week ago or so
Right.
for denouncing something Trump did in
Yeah.
regards to.
Yeah, that was quite something to watch. That was
Yeah,
like, I can't even imagine preaching at somebody over the pulpit. Like, just,
yeah,
yeah, just kind of like this very divisive, not, it was obviously a political move, not
yeah, not
a very
not
spiritual move.
spiritually
Yeah.
guided at all. Yeah,
Well, and I think
um,
that's a very interesting point because you and I were talking on X, and we've noticed quite a lot of politics online as we've kind of responded to different people and just looked at the different comments that people are saying about the church. I don't know if you have read the book called The Great Dechurching.
I have not now.
Yeah, well, that book, just for the audience, and I mentioned it before to my audience, but just to go over it again, the book kind of goes over the main reasons why people are choosing to leave their different congregations. It actually has a lot to do with politics. So, like, just generally speaking, the book goes into different demographics of people and specifically why they're leaving, but overall, there's this general overarching theme, and that is that people on the right are leaving their churches because they don't view their leadership, or they don't view the church as staying orthodox enough to their principles. And then on the
Mhm.
left, you have people leaving because obviously they think that their church is not liberal enough with their principles. So this is a problem that's been ongoing. People have been leaving their churches over these kind of political issues for a while now. And it's happening throughout all of the churches. It's not just a Latter-day Saint problem. And in fact, the
Mhm.
Latter-day Saint church has had fewer people leaving the church than what is typical in other churches. So I just found that was a very interesting statistic. And you've been very, very active on X, kind of responding to some of the people who, on first glance, would appear to have left the LDS church. Can you kind of
Yeah.
describe what you've been noticing?
So, I live in Utah, and I'll admit, even though I was out of the church, I 100% fell for the all is well in Zion mentality.
Uh,
Because when you only look at the surface level politics in the state, it would certainly seem that way, that there's not a lot of cause for concern. But when I started diving deeper into state level politics, it really started last year in 2024. I'm sure most people have heard of Phil Lyman at this point. That's when I started looking into state level politics. I was like, okay, I'm gonna get involved in local politics, and I'm gonna
hmm,
I'm gonna be the voice of reason,
yeah,
the person who sort of just looks at things objectively, calls out problems, and suggests solutions. And so I started looking into the candidates who were running, and I really liked Phil Lyman. His main campaign focus was on state level government corruption, which most people probably don't think is a problem at all.
I think that
But
would probably be
turns
fair to
out,
say.
as it turns out, there is quite a significant amount of corruption on the state level. Um, the most notable of which it has to do with the lieutenant governor's office. The most problematic thing being that the lieutenant governor oversees their own election, whereas most other states have a secretary of state who oversees elections. That isn't the case here, which for whatever reason I couldn't tell you,
I
but
see.
it's
But
not.
so the concern is that there might be a conflict of interest there because they get to run.
Yeah, yes, there's definitely a conflict of interest there. And there's always going to be some kind of conflict of interest. I mean, in most other states, the Secretary of State is either appointed by an election of their own or appointed by a governor
Mhm.
who, is affected by the election. But there does need to be some buffer. Definitely helps to have that buffer. And along with, like, for example, Spencer Cox, his campaign got a lot of donations from developers in the Utah area. And then, after this election cycle, he basically announces this plan to
Hmm.
begin building a lot of new houses in
Yeah, for the
places that aren't as developed as the Wasatch Front. And he was probably going to be getting some kickbacks from
hmm.
those developers for helping them make money by ramming developments through. But anyway, and there's also this group called Envision Utah. If anyone knows, so what the World Economic Forum is, they're basically just a local version of that. They advocate for a lot of the same stuff and push for a lot of the same sort of policy changes.
Yeah, I actually have heard of them, I believe. I believe they are a focus group, aren't they? And they pay for they're not only a focus group, they are a lobbying firm. So
Yes.
lots of people get bent out of shape because of lobbying that happens in the federal government. Well, the same thing happens in the state governments as well. So that's something that
Yes.
we should all be aware of. I mean, it's perfectly
Yeah.
legal under the Federalist Papers. It's something that everybody has a right to do. But if you're not aware of it, then that's kind of, that kind of presents an issue. For example, with the
Yeah.
Spencer Cox issue, I think that him receiving a whole lot of money from from developers is kind of problematic if he's going to be solving the housing issue, you know, then it seems to me that there's a big possibility of corruption in
Yeah.
presenting
Yeah.
solutions that
It
favor
is.
certain companies rather than other development companies, let's say.
Yeah. And the thing is
Yeah.
like, we are in a housing crisis. There's no denying that. But at the same time, you know, there are solutions. Building houses is obviously the first solution people go to. But what a lot of people probably don't know either is that Spencer Cox has effectively suspended the enforcement of immigration laws in Utah
Mm,
and made us a de facto sanctuary state. Well, there's now a large population of illegal immigrants here.
that's true, actually.
So
Yep.
this is sort of the housing crisis in Utah sort of presents a rare example in the supply and demand dynamic where you can directly decrease the demand for a product, in this case housing, by deporting illegal immigrants and freeing up housing units that way.
And also
But
reducing regulations, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, reducing
Instead of giving a
regulations.
whole
There's a
bunch of
lot of
money to people in order to build houses, which is what he's doing.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's the problem. I disagree with that method of top-down solution. I think that the solution would
hmm
be better to reduce regulation and to fulfill the law in keeping immigration out. There's something that I've been
yeah,
seeing floating around there out there in the ether is this idea that the church supports, going back to this idea of why people are leaving the church, why people are leaving the LDS church, this idea that the church is supporting principles that are not in line with their personal politics. And
yeah.
on the
That goes.
conservative side, I've been seeing this quite often on X, for example, particularly
Mhm.
now that the church has come out with this new letter. People are saying that the church is supporting illegal immigration, for example. So,
Yeah, that's a
yeah,
little ridiculous. That would go directly against the 12th article of faith.
yeah, which is to sustain the law, right?
Mm.
Now, what the letter says, right, and we could actually read that. I'll probably just put it up on the screen. But the law, just to paraphrase what it says, is that the church does not support families being separated from one another, but they also do not agree with the idea of illegal immigration, and they agree with sustaining the law in enforcing the law. So the
Mhm.
church is taking a pretty middle road down the center of the aisle here. They're not supporting
Yeah,
one position or the other. They're saying, yes, we agree that families shouldn't be separated. At the same time, we need to obey the law and enforce the law. So
yeah.
that they're being very fair, I believe. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, what have you been seeing online though? That kind of
So, sorry. I would say that as far as politically motivated apostasy goes, the left leaning arguments, left leaning apostasy is definitely the majority of political motivated apostasy,
mm,
where people develop morals that don't align with the teachings of the church. And since they can't change the church, well, some of them stay and try to, anyways. Those are the ones we refer to as progmos or
right.
progressive Mormons, progressive,
The Julie
members of
Hanks
the
types, right?
church. Yeah,
Yeah.
your typical, I don't really like to use the term liberal because it's not really what they represent. If you know what
Yeah, I think
the real definition of
progressive is
liberal,
probably
I
pretty
think
much.
progressive is the best definition. I have been seeing an increase in right leaning apostasy,
Yeah,
which
me too.
essentially boils down to you have people who sort of see all these problems in the Utah state government, with Spencer Cox and what essentially boils down to brazen corruption happening, brazen bribery. I mean, legally speaking, you're not gonna be able to convict these people of bribery because the law does allow for these loopholes,
Hmm.
sort of, where it's like, oh well, it's not bribery because we're donating to their campaign or some other variation of that, like their
Yeah, they're
company, their truck,
lobbying, right?
whatever.
They're
Yeah.
doing, yeah. Which I mean,
But
okay.
it is, at the end of the day, when you look at the effect it has, it is effectively bribery,
Hmm.
even if the law doesn't see it that way. But yeah, they blame the church for all this, which is
Yeah,
pretty
which is
ironic.
remarkable.
It's ironic considering that the church, reading the doctrine of the church, pretty much condemns everything happening in the state government. And the reason it's able to happen in the state government is because a lot of the brethren, they don't really pay attention to the state level politics. Unfortunately, they fall for the all is well in Zion mentality. And when you look at the surface level stuff, that there is some truth to that. I mean, Utah is still, even with all the stuff going on, it's still a very nice place to live. There's not a lot of issues on the
Yeah.
surface level, and you do have to do some digging to find the issues that are
Yeah.
plaguing us.
Well, yeah, how many people knew about Envision Utah, for example?
Yeah,
And
Vision Youth
I
is
think it is
not a
pretty
very well known
typical,
group. Yeah.
yeah, to be more focused on the federal issues. I think that
Hmm.
that is more in the news. It's more, and people just have this perception that it affects them more, when in reality, we should also be paying attention to the state government. I think maybe another
Hmm.
way to conceptualize it too is that maybe the brethren are more concerned with a general overview of it rather than politics, because it
Hmm.
doesn't seem like many of them are very, like, their their messaging is not political necessarily.
Yeah.
They're just
Hmm.
giving a general overarching prescription, and then some people some people like to read their own politics into those messages. Like, I saw
Yeah.
that quite a lot, and people were very upset about Elder Oaks's conference talk, and they perceived that as Elder Oaks giving ground, or like conceding ground to who they perceived to be their liberal opponents. However, they
Yeah.
ignored the fact that he had
Yeah.
said
Yeah.
in the same talk, don't, abandon your priorities and principles as well.
Yeah. A lot of the people who push the idea that the church is behind political issues in Utah, they sort of spin these half truths. It only takes some of the talk and be like, "Oh, look, this is proof that the church is in on destroying Utah,"
Yeah.
which is pretty ridiculous, a pretty ridiculous claim to make. But again, like with most arguments against the church, when you actually do some digging to uncover the truth, you find that you've either been told a half truth or an outright fabrication. Um, I will say that right leaning apostasy does rely on half truths a lot more. They will sort of take snippets of things out of context
Yeah.
and spin it in a way that makes it seem like the church is apostatizing.
Yeah, that was
Uh,
really interesting too. I noticed that. So, like, one example that I saw recently was, they would the person on X would put up this news article, and the news article was written in such a way that it made it look like the church was supporting LGBTQ legislation in Florida, for example.
mhm.
But in reality, what the church was doing was supporting legislation that would make it more difficult to discriminate against people based on not only their orientation but also their religion, so that they couldn't be kicked out of their homes. And that seemed rather, reasonable to me. They weren't supporting the lifestyle of LGBTQ plus individuals,
Mhm.
but that's the way that the article kind of sounded. So maybe a part
Mhm.
of it too is just the way that the media kind of spins things.
That is definitely an issue. I
Yeah.
mean, Deseret News and KSL, they do tend to spin things in that sort of way,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. I mean, these institutions are owned by the church, but
Yeah, and then they make it
they're
kind of
not
seem,
managed. It's not like Russell M. Nelson is the one deciding what gets published and what
right.
doesn't.
Yeah.
There's this chain of command, and it's the people in charge of these news outlets who ultimately are responsible for this view that people are able to push. Like the Deseret News and KSL, especially in recent times, have adopted sort of a more progressive leaning
Hmm.
viewpoint in regards to local and federal politics, which does sort of make people lose faith in the church
Hmm.
because they're owned by the church, but they're not necessarily managed
Like,
by.
micromanaged by the upper levels of the
Yeah,
church authority.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense.
I don't. Yeah, but a lot of it, a lot of it does boil down to the brethren could be doing a better job paying attention to state and local politics, for sure, and applying the teachings and warnings of the scriptures to local politics.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, within a lot of people's living memory, we had a prophet, Ezra Taft Benson, who essentially warned us that we had secret combinations conspiring to destroy the Constitution
Hmm.
and the liberties and rights of all peoples and lands. And now all of those warnings have basically come to be warranted, in my opinion.
Hmm.
And
I think a lot of people would
I
agree.
think, yeah, yeah, and people, people sort of hear these talks that Ezra Taft Benson gave, and they're like, "Oh, why don't we hear stuff like this at General Conference anymore?" And to that extent, I mean, well, the church is a lot bigger now than it was then. We are definitely a global church. Most of the members reside outside of the U.S. and outside of Utah too. Um, but the church has global responsibilities and needs to take into consideration when giving general conference talks and stuff like that. But in this last general conference, Elder Bednar, he did make mention of one of the talks people like to repost or republish on the internet from Ezra Taft Benson,
Yeah.
where he reiterates the warning in the Book of Mormon that any nation who supports secret combinations to get power and gain and to spread over the nation, they shall be destroyed. And Bednar referenced this. Of course, he sort of reframes it to be in the pride cycle, that the secret combinations are only able to be built up because of the pride people have in their hearts,
Interesting.
which is definitely true. That is 100% true. People now are a lot more prideful of themselves than they were in the past,
Hmm. Yeah.
which does play into the pride cycle laid out in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. Well, and when you consider just the top leadership, how some of them, not all of them, but how a lot of them, there's quite a few of them who kind of look down on people who they view as lesser than them.
Hmm.
And it's really quite sad. It's quite a condemnation in my view. Eh, they really do have a disdain for one another. Let's put it that way. I think that we have developed in our society a distrust of one another and a
Hmm.
disdain for one another that is becoming quite disturbing. And I said
Hmm.
this uh, prior to uh, prior to Trump being um, sworn in. But if that assassin had succeeded in taking Trump's life, this country would have never been the same again. We would never have recovered
Yeah.
from that.
Hmm.
And it's only by the grace of God that he was spared, and we have not torn ourselves apart. And we are still on the precipice of doing that, by the way.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean,
that this is something that is so serious. Like if he would have died, that's something that we would have never recovered from because we
yeah.
would have just blamed each other and it would have been horrible. So,
A lot of people speculate that would have been the spark that ignited another civil war, and
yeah.
there probably is some truth to that, though. It's hard to speculate on things that didn't actually happen.
Yeah.
As far as Trump goes, I agree with his idea of sort of exposing and rooting out corruption in the government, because I believe that is the biggest issue of our time is government corruption.
Mhm.
And I understand a lot of people in the church may not like him based on a moral standpoint. He's done some immoral things in the past. Of course, there's a lot of lies told about him too, especially by the media. But even when you dig into those, even with the things that are objectively true, like his many divorces and stuff like that, there's just things that people don't agree morally, and uh, you know I kind of get that, but at the end of the day, when you're going to the voting booth, you have to be looking at the policies and the things that the person is running on.
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, that's what's most important in an elected official.
Yeah, if he's going to be supporting the principles that are conducive to the
Yeah,
principles of the gospel, correct?
yeah,
Yeah, I can agree with that. That's for sure. Well, I think that just to wrap it up, you wanted to say a few words, I think, in regards to secret combinations that may be happening online as we speak, right?
yeah, yeah.
We've
So
both noticed this phenomenon, and it it makes me very suspicious. Well, I'll go ahead and let you explain it though.
yes, a lot of this mostly comes from right-leaning accounts, of course. Left-leaning accounts, you usually use completely different arguments and tactics, but
Hmm.
a lot of right-leaning accounts, I sort of suspect that they only claim to be members of the church.
Or former members of the
They,
church.
yeah, or former members of the
Yeah.
church, in an attempt to sort of drive a wedge between
Mm.
church members and
The leadership, right?
yeah, and the leadership, of course. But what I've noticed is that there's a lot of half truths being spun by these right leaning accounts, where they'll take, like, like you mentioned, Oakes's recent talk about being peacemakers, where they'll all sort of take parts of it and, like, oh, look, this is proof that the church leaders are supporting, like, disagree better, or they want you to, like, abandon your principles or whatever.
Yeah.
But literally in that same talk, Oak says to not give up on your convictions and principles and to stay true to the gospel.
Yeah.
So there's
Oh, it was so interesting to me.
there's a lot of room to suspect that a lot of these people are just trying to destroy the church from outside. And
Yeah.
they could be conspiring together in a secret combination. They might not be. It could be spontaneous,
Well, yeah.
something spontaneous, but ultimately, either way, it would be orchestrated of the devil.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting to me too because I saw people who I recognized also echoing the same things. So
Hmm.
it was like not accusing them of being a part of the the conspiracy. If there are people who are out there who are lying, who are not members of the church, who start these things, but then
Yeah.
everybody else starts echoing them, that's a
Hmm.
problem. We need to be aware of it as well. So
Hmm.
because that it
Yeah.
does create kind of like an echo, online.
Yeah. And what a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, every aspect,
Yeah.
every ideology, a lot of people just aren't really capable of having a nuanced view, an objective view, and that leads to issues where you just sort of you have these political cliques and these political groups
Hmm.
who center around ideologies, various ideologies. I couldn't name them all in the time we have left, but they're everywhere, and they sort of just get stuck in their beliefs, and they're unwilling to consider that there might be nuance, or there might be, they don't want to hear other people's opinions, essentially. And I see that a lot everywhere. And what a lot of people need to consider is that the Utah state government and the church leadership are distinct entities who in the past have definitely had converging goals. But as the state government has sort of been corrupted, and as these secret combinations of our day have worked their way into positions of power, especially in the state government, we do see diverging interests now, where you have the church with the 12th article of faith saying that we should sustain the law, and then you have Governor Spencer Cox, who has effectively suspended the enforcement of immigration laws in Utah, making us a de facto sanctuary state. And people blame the church for that,
Yeah.
because
You were
Cox
very
is the one that,
frustrated about that. You mentioned to me that you were very frustrated that people were blaming the church for the corruption that is happening in the state.
yeah,
That was very interesting to me.
Yeah. So what bothers me with that is, I should start with saying, I guess the church is to blame insofar as the brethren are the body of the church. And a lot of the brethren have sort of failed to give any meaningful thought to state level politics. I think I brought this up earlier, but the all and well in Zion mentality is very well and alive, unfortunately, to our detriment, because all is not well. All is not well here. And getting into the nitty gritty details of this, we could talk about this for hours.
Hmm.
But to wrap it up, people blaming the church leadership for political issues is not a very nuanced, it's not a very objective argument, because they pretty much just assume that nothing in the state government happens without approval from the leadership,
Hmm.
as if the leadership are the ones actually in control of the state government. And that might have been true in the past when it needed to be, like with Brigham Young and, the sort of early, what a lot of people refer to as the Deseret era of the church, where our main goal was basically just to survive.
Yeah.
Um, but that's not true anymore. The leadership is focused on global outreach, sounding the gospel of Christ in all ears and in all nations,
Hmm.
as we have been commanded to do. And so, because of that, the church leadership admittedly also isn't paying very close attention to state level politics, because they don't need to. They need to be focused on the global outreach and the spreading of God's word.
Yeah. Which
And
makes sense.
so the responsibility then falls on the brethren to pay attention to state level politics. And unfortunately, they've failed to do so in any meaningful way.
Yeah. Well, maybe too, maybe I'll challenge you a little bit on that idea. Maybe it's our responsibility to be focused on the state government rather than their responsibility.
Well, I mean, we as members of the church, we are the brethren.
Yeah, gotcha. I see what you
Yeah.
mean now. Okay.
So when
The
I reference the
brethren,
brethren, I mean
everyone.
all the faithful members of the church. I mean the women too, even though I just call it the brethren.
I
The
see.
easiest way to describe it.
Okay, okay. Thank you for clarifying that, because I thought when you're saying the brethren, you were referring to the 12 apostles
No, no
and
way.
the 15.
As I understand it, the brethren is all members of the church.
Ah, I see. Okay. All right. You mentioned that you were an atheist at the beginning of this.
Yeah.
And so you started having these spiritual experiences, and I just wanted to leave on this note. How would you recommend somebody in your same position who is also an atheist? How would you recommend to them if they wanted to have a similar experience? What would you recommend that they do?
Well, it's hard for me to describe,
Yeah.
because admittedly, when I started having these things, I was not a very righteous person. I was struggling with various addictions,
Hmm.
pornography and cannabis, to were the main ones. And a lot of other people on the internet will say that in order to have these experiences, you need to be living a righteous lifestyle. And well, I think
Apparently
that
that's
might
not
help.
true, is it?
Yeah, I think that might help with a lot of cases. But
Huh.
at the end of the day, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, and God and Jesus Christ, they exist outside of the church, outside of people's spiritual convictions,
Hmm.
so to say. Uh, and
I
it
like that.
just
It's like
it
that God wants to reach out to you regardless, which is
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. I guess my best advice is to consider that what a lot of people would describe as their own intuition, maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe there's some a greater power behind that. Because I've talked to a few people, a lot of the people I follow on X. There's some other ex-atheists out there. They share a similar story to mine, where they just sort of start getting these promptings. And for those who don't feel these things, or who struggle to feel these things, even for faithful members of the church, I guess Just take some time to reflect on yourself, to reflect on things you've done, or
Hmm.
reflect on, you know, your failures, shortcomings, but not just that, the things you like, the things you're proud of, your accomplishments and your virtues, and just be honest with yourself and consider that you may not know everything, that there may be
Hmm.
things which you think you know that you need to reconsider. Just be open to reconsidering everything and anything,
Interesting.
because the truth will always prevail. And if you think you know something, you should still ask yourself, why do you think you know this? Because if it is true, if what you believe is true, you will come to the same conclusion if you are searching earnestly and honestly.
Hmm. Just having kind of an open mind rather than just closing oneself off to it. I think
Yeah.
that that's kind of important. Yeah. That's a really good point. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Are there any other closing remarks that you'd like to leave us with before we go? All right, well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story with us and sharing your thoughts and just kind of giving us an overview of what's going on out there online in terms of conservative politics and liberal politics. I know we don't really typically talk about that on this show, but I think it's
Yeah.
interesting for
Politics
sure.
is something a lot of people would like to avoid.
Yeah.
Admittedly, there is some. I kind of understand that, especially with how divisive and hateful people are on the internet.
Yeah.
And there's not just one group behind the hate and divisiveness on the internet. It's,
It's everyone.
people
Yeah.
people will point out that it originated in a sort of top-down kind of way
Hmm.
from certain organizations and government institutions,
Hmm.
and that is true. It didn't used to be this divisive. I mean, I recently saw this political meme from 2004. It was by this YouTube creator called Jib Jab, and it was titled "This Land Is My Land." It was Bush, and I think the person he was running against at the time. And there's this political unity in that meme that's just gone now.
Oh,
It just doesn't exist anymore, and it's
kind of sad.
tragic,
Yeah.
but it is what it is. But ultimately, politics has to be discussed, and for those who are really into politics, and whether you agree with me or not, I think we could all benefit from not playing into the divisiveness, not attacking each other, and just having honest discussions about political beliefs,
Hmm.
why we believe them, why we think they're better than, say, other political beliefs. And we could do this without tearing each other down. A lot of the reason people avoid politics is because they had a family member or a friend who might have had of a diverging political view,
Mm.
which jeopardized their relationship with that person,
Or even drove them
which
out
is
of the house.
tragic. I would never do that to anyone I know personally. I value my connections to my family and my friends a lot more than political beliefs, because at the end of the day, if you're able to have a honest and objective discussion, you could very easily convince a lot of people of what you believe if you just plan out what you word and not fall into the divisive, name
Right.
calling, hateful speech, and all the other stuff that plagues politics.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important too because on that note, we have people leaving the church because of these issues on both
Hmm.
sides of the aisle. It's not just a
Hmm.
right problem; it's mostly a left problem, but it's also a right problem.
Yeah,
So
I would say, like I mentioned earlier, most politically motivated apostasy does come
yeah,
from the progressives and those who are more left leaning and more inclined to care about social and cultural issues.
Yeah. So you guys out there in the audience, you could definitely face a situation where it might be beneficial to talk about these things in a logical, well put together way in order to help preserve people's faiths. So that's just
Yeah,
something to consider.
and be wary
Yeah.
of the wolves in sheep's clothing
Yeah.
who are going to use political arguments to try to destroy the church.
Yeah. People who are
Just
not necessarily members of the church pretending to be,
yeah,
trying to divide a wedge between, trying to get you to be separated from your church and your beliefs because of politics. Very wise.
yes, yes, and we live in it, even with all the things going on, I do believe we live in a great time. And
Yeah.
if you want to know whether or not something someone is saying is true or not, well, we have your phone, a computer. You can do the digging and research the things on your own, which is I did that a lot for both religious and political issues, which evidently led me to believe what I believe now.
Oh,
And a lot of the a lot of the political issues we face could be resolved with honest, open discussion.
yeah. I think so. Well, thank you again so much. All right. If you haven't already, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Our goal is to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of, well, we've already gone through 1 month. So we've got 2 more months left. And we're almost there. We've almost got 10,000 subscribers. So we're very close to getting there. So it's really exciting when these important messages can reach a lot more people if we do this.
Yeah.
So, all right. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. And until next time, bye.
Bye.